I also think it's interesting just how close we are to Iowa, because the polls clearly were showing a dead heat on the Democratic side and some really interesting dynamics happening on the Republican side. And yes, could it throw Mike Huckabee off to the side? Could it bring Rudy Giuliani back to the front in some of these primaries? Maybe. But I also think that I think voters have been through this before. They've been through 9/11 and they've made decisions based on it. And perhaps there may be some voters who don't want to go through this again and do still want to change, especially given the fact that we are headed down a path of being kind of always in an adversarial position in the world, especially in the Middle East. And I think they'll be looking for someone who can bring us toward a positive direction instead of reacting to terrorism, always reacting to terrorism, finding a path toward a positive foreign policy and a positive place for the United States in the global atmosphere. And I don't know. I'm not sure voters are going to have that same visceral knee-jerk reaction. Of course, I could be wrong.
Well, of course, I think what you may be saying could be the case in the Democratic primaries, where people haven't been pleased with George Bush's foreign policy over the past 7 years. But in the Republican primaries, you're going to have a lot of voters looking at this situation, looking back over the past 7 years, saying we haven't been attacked since 9/11. Things are becoming more stable in Iraq because of the surge that the president pushed alone, other than with John McCain. Iran is not developing nuclear weapons, and in part, we think, as Rudy Giuliani said earlier this morning, because of our invasion of Iraq in 2003 and because that put them back on their heels. Republicans, again, will say not only did it put Iran back on its heels, but George Bush's foreign policy also put Gaddafi back on his heels. We've got North Korea also talking about getting rid of nuclear weapons. We've got somebody in France that's more pro-American than they were before George Bush was president of the United States. We've got somebody in Germany who is more pro-American than the leader we had before George Bush was president of the United States. These are things that Republicans are starting to say among themselves. And so it's so interesting, David Shuster, that you've got Democrats who are talking about whether they want to break from the past with Barack Obama or whether they want to go back to the future with Hillary Clinton. And on the Democratic side, you have a lot of Democrats that loved the 90s, that thought Bill Clinton was one of the best presidents in at least the past half century. Isn't that the question Democrats will be asking moving forward?
I think that's a question, but Joe, I like you a lot, but I cannot let you get by with what you just said about George Bush and his foreign policy successes. Are you really saying that the president's foreign policy in all these places has been a success and that most Republicans think it's been a success? I mean, because that's not the polling that I'm seeing, and that's not what I'm hearing from Republicans in Iowa who say, look, we want somebody we can trust, we want somebody who is smart, but we also want somebody who is competent this time. And when people look up and see the problems in Pakistan, sure, maybe they're going to be fearful, but I think they're also going to wonder, well, how did we get into this situation? How did we get into a situation where the United States has no good options?
Well, David, first of all, I'm not only telling you what I hear from Republicans, and as I know you don't know this, as a former member of Congress, I know a little bit about Republican politics. I'm telling you what I hear on the ground from Republicans that helped elect George Bush in 2000 and again in 2004. And I also look at polls that show that George Bush is still popular among Republicans. And if you look at the polls that have been taken more recently since the surge's impact has come in place, you'll see those numbers are continuing to go up even higher. So, yes, I think on the Republican side, it's going to be very hard for people to distance themselves from George W. Bush and foreign policy. As far as Pakistan goes, David, I don't want to get into a debate this morning, but I will say that Pakistan has been a chaotic mess since, my gosh, over the past 10, 15 years. When they got nuclear weapons in 1997, a lot of people in Congress on both sides of the aisle were talking about that chaotic situation. When you had a military coup and Musharraf took place, my God, I remember the morning I read that news in the Washington Post and went to work on the Armed Services Committee. People were horrified. They're a lot more horrified than I would guess they are in Washington this morning. So I think it is a stretch to blame the situation in Pakistan on George W. Bush, and I would only repeat what Andrea Mitchell said earlier today, that they were dealing with a lot of very bad options.
Hey, Joe, I think I don't even know where to begin. If the United States had taken care of business in Afghanistan along the Pakistan border, had taken care of al-Qaeda, had sent 150,000 troops there instead of to Iraq, which had nothing to do with the al-Qaeda attacks in 9/11, then al-Qaeda and the Taliban, they wouldn't have the influence, the destabilizing influence they have over Pakistan today.
David, first of all, if the United States, and I talked to a general when I made a similar argument about a year ago to a general, didn't we make a mistake sending all of our troops to Iraq instead of Afghanistan? And the general said, well, you know, a lot of the remnants of the Taliban and al-Qaeda went across the border into Pakistan, so we could have 5 million troops in Afghanistan. It would require an invasion of Pakistan to be able to blow them out of the western side of that country. I understand, David, and again, let me back up. I understand what I'm saying is radical because there's been a steady drumbeat in the press over the past 4 years that has suggested that every single thing that George W. Bush has done has been wrong. All I'm reporting to you is what Republicans have been telling me. Republicans that were disturbed by what George W. Bush did in Katrina. Republicans that were disturbed with what George W. Bush did following Donald Rumsfeld. I'm telling you, among the base of Republicans, they see a steadying of the ship when they got rid of Rumsfeld, when they brought on Robert Gates, when he started listening to Condoleezza Rice more than Dick Cheney. I'm telling you, and you don't have to like it if you don't want to, okay, but a lot of Republicans look at the globe and they see that things have gotten better. They've gotten better in Iraq. We've got good news out of Iran. And so, yes, it's a dangerous world. But among Republican voters, there's no doubt that distancing yourself from George W. Bush's foreign policy right now may not be a good idea on the campaign trail.
Joe Scarborough, David Shuster, hold that thought as we continue to cover this developing story out of Pakistan. And coming up after the break, we're going to hear from CNBC's Aaron Burnett and Bill Cairns with the weather. We'll be right back.